Ethel's brother, Jim, and his wife, Virginia, were still in California when they heard the news. Virginia called Hickory Hill. "Ethel, I just wanted you to know that we're thinking about you. And you're in our prayers," she said. "Gee, kid, thanks so much," Ethel responded. "Thank Jimmy for thinking of me. It's great to hear from you. Sorry you couldn't make the funeral, but I'll call you when I'm on the West Coast." Virginia felt like crying, but she remembered clearly that Ethel was strong as a horse. "I said, you know, Ethel, Jim said a very interesting thing. He said that maybe David's death will cause the other children in the family to wake up if they have a problem. Ours and the Skakel family and the rest of yours." And she said, "I beg your pardon, just what does Jimmy mean by that?" I said, "Well, think about it. There's a lot of kids in the family, and who knows how they're going to turn out." But Ethel's angry, and that was the end of the call. Well, of course, Ethel was angry. How dare somebody suggest that this sort of tragedy could happen again, or that there's anything wrong with her children? Ethel, wake up. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Denise. We're going to keep going in The Other Mrs. Kennedy today, and this is our second to last episode. Today we're going to cover 2 chapters, hopefully, so long as my voice holds out. Obviously, I'm sure you can hear that I'm still sick. My voice is still nasally and grovelly, and it's a little bit annoying to listen to, but we'll see how long we can go. So hopefully we can get in 2 chapters. The first chapter will be about David and his unfortunate but not surprising demise because of drugs. And then the next chapter is entitled The End of a Dynasty. The next episode that we'll do is the last 2 chapters, and then we're done. And I do not know which book we'll do next. I haven't found anything that I thought, wow, everyone really wants to hear that. And I have made some surprisingly bad choices in the past on what I thought you all would want to listen to. Need I recall when I read Worthy, the story that Jada Pinkett Smith wrote, the fictional tale of her life. Anyway, so I just want to make sure that I find something that's worth your time, because I spend months on these books, and I just can't read something stupid for months and months. Anyway, don't worry, I'll still be putting out videos, but I'm just on the hunt for the next good thing to read. If only Meghan Markle would finally write her tell-all memoir. We could only hope. You know who I really wish would write a book? I wish that Amber Heard would finally sit down and tell her sad little tale. Oh, man. Of course, it'd all be lies, but it'd be interesting to see what she'd say. Just like when Harry wrote Spare. What a fairy tale book that was, but it was a gem. It was so fun to read. That was probably one of my favorite books I've read, just because it was so dumb. Which, you know, I just finished saying I cannot spend months on a dumb book. I can if it's the right kind of dumb. Anyway, let's get into today's chapters. This chapter begins after the Harlem Hotel incident and hospitalization. David went into a year-long drug rehabilitation program in Sacramento, California. Aquarian Effort, as it was called, was run by a 41-year-old therapist named Don Jewell, who had treated other celebrities such as Beach Boys' Dennis Wilson, who eventually died of a drug overdose. The $100,000 fee that Jewell received for his services was not paid for by Ethel or any other member of the Kennedy family. It came out of David's own trust fund. That was his Uncle Ted's idea. It was part of the clan's tough love philosophy, and it made David furious because he felt the treatment was overrated as well as overpriced. Probably $100,000? You're helping one person. Are they that difficult to be around that you need to charge $100,000 and then they end up dying of a drug overdose anyway? Dennis Wilson. I agreed to take it because my Uncle Ted told me to get my act together. I'd wind up in an institution for the rest of my life like his sister Rosemary, David told his best pal in Sacramento, Nancy Alexander. I tried to minister to him. I tried to care for him. All he wanted was his family's love and he couldn't get it, Nancy said later. The object of much of David's anger and wrath was his mother. Often he'd angrily denounce Ethel with a litany of complaints. She's oblivious to my problems, he told Nancy. She doesn't love me. She never wanted 11 children. It was my father who wanted all those kids. It was part of his Kennedy dynasty concept. My father felt Uncle Ted and John didn't do their part, so my father made up for it. Those stories about what a big, happy family he had at Hickory Hill were all bullshit. Life at home was mayhem, a mess. My mother was always having screaming rages. The house looked like a shithole. She didn't know how to deal with so many kids. She didn't have the skills to raise 11 children. She didn't have the skills to run a house. If my father was alive, he'd never have sent me here. Every published account of David's addiction implied he was driven to drugs, because of the trauma of witnessing his father's death on television. David himself, however, scoffed at the armchair analysis. I am what I am because I come from a whole line of alcoholics. Just look at how many of us are effed up. My brother Bobby's a junkie, but I take all the blame. During David's year in exile, Ethel had made several quick trips to see him. She's just doing her motherly thing, he'd say. Her visits were always secret and tied to social calls on friends in San Francisco and in the town of Davis. David desperately wanted his mother to be involved in his life, Nancy Alexander believed, but it was clear to him that she was not going to be. After each mother-son get-together, David returned to Sacramento in a depressed state. For a time in Sacramento, David worked on a construction job, then boasted about the prospect of becoming a millionaire as a distributor of Amway products. At the same time, he wrote a $500 rubber check for an overhaul on his BMW, even though he was living on $2,000 a month from his trust fund. For several months, he dated Nancy Norleski, a local girl whom the Kennedys disliked, then began seeing Paula Scully, a fashion photographer that he had met in Aspen, whom the Kennedys did like. The two moved in together, and members of the clan, seeing how good marriage had been for Bobby, lobbied for David to do the same. Well, David may have gone to drug rehabilitation, and maybe he's dating some girl that the Kennedys like, but he's not done trying to manipulate the way he experiences the world, and he's quite clever in getting himself to have some kind of reaction even without drugs. The book says that off heroin, David drank and got high by purposely putting himself into hypoglycemic-like states. He'd stop eating, become shaky, clammy, turn pale, and hallucinate. Because he couldn't get any drugs into his system, he allowed this to happen, Alexander said. It altered his state of consciousness, and that was David's goal. I found out about his hypoglycemic game one day when I went over to his apartment. Paula, who was very, very good to David and took care of him, was really angry, and she was saying, "You do this on purpose. This is stupid. It's dangerous." He laughed and said, "I'm not diabetic. I'm only hypoglycemic." Paul was furious and told him, "It's still a deadly game." Right after his $100,000 treatment ended, David was arrested for driving drunk, pleaded guilty, and paid $380 fine. Don Jewell said, "As far as the problems of the past go, they're all over. He's in no kind of trouble." This Don Jewell guy sounds like he was a real shyster, if you ask me. This person seems like they are up to their elbows in all kinds of fraud and schemes, because why are you charging people $100,000 and then pretending that their addiction to alcohol is just like a no thing? Like, well, see, he's not on heroin anymore, so there's certainly not anything for us to worry about. Alcohol is super dangerous. I mean, it can be. Any sort of therapist that would tell you that your sobriety has been completed because you're no longer involved in the drug of your choice, but you clearly swapped it out for something else, isn't worth the dirt on the bottom of your shoe. That therapist needs to be kicked to the curb. Here he is losing himself in the sauce constantly, putting himself into hypoglycemic-like states so that he can hallucinate and sort of leave the realms of reality. And this Don Jewell's like, any problems of the past are in the past. There's no reason to worry. Okay, Don. In the fall of 1982, David left Sacramento with sketchy plans to return to Harvard and become a lawyer or a journalist. I went to cut David's hair the night before he left and to say goodbye to him, Nancy Alexander recalled. I told him I'd take them to the airport. I borrowed my girlfriend's beat-up Volkswagen van, but when I got to David's place, I had to wake him up. When we finally got to the airport, I saw something strange happen. Here's David running to the ticket counter with his beautiful black leather jacket on, his shirt tails flying, his hair's all messed up, and the ticket agents are being very rude to him. See them thinking, look at this punk kid. All of a sudden, he gave his name, and it came up on the computer screen. Kennedy, David. And they suddenly realized who they were dealing with. I was standing right next to David, and I saw this look come across his face. It was a look of disappointment. All of a sudden, they realized he was a Kennedy, and they were very nice and very polite and falling all over themselves to help him with his luggage. And that upset him because David thought that he was nothing, that he didn't deserve any fanfare. He hated being sick, and he believed that he wasn't good enough to be a Kennedy. I kissed him goodbye, and then I watched him board the plane, and then I cried. Nancy Alexander never heard from David again. That poignant moment at the airport was the last time she saw him alive. In Boston, David got an apartment on Beacon Hill with Paula Scully and worked as a clerk intern at the Atlantic Monthly. With a year or two to go towards his undergraduate degree, he re-enrolled at Harvard, but he dropped out after a semester. Since 1980, Peter Collier, a contributing editor at California Magazine, and David Horowitz, a Rolling Stone writer, had been working on a landmark book, The Kennedys, an American Drama. David, along with other members of his generation, had talked openly to the authors. When Playboy ran an excerpt from the book in May 1984, David was bitterly criticized for breaching the family faith, the authors wrote in a note to their book. The word used in condemning him was treason. Treason? What dynasty do they think that they have? What nation do they own? What royal grandeur have they created in their own minds that somebody who deigns to criticize the chaotic upbringing that he had should be called out as a traitor? Treason? What is this high-handed language? The levels of delusion that you would have reached to be so self-centered that you could not imagine that anyone could criticize the upbringing that they had when it involved a filthy house, parents who were never there, constant confusion, adults in and out of your life who were supposed to take care of you but who really didn't, constantly switching schools, constantly having issues, and then you're just supposed to grow up and just be real happy you got to be a Kennedy. Being a Kennedy doesn't sound that great. Behind the scenes, it's a mystique that only the outside can appreciate, but the people on the inside are like, what is this? And David is in trouble because he said, I don't think it was that great. Maybe just make it great, and then you don't have to be upset when anybody pulls back the curtain on reality. The Kennedy family called the piece, quote, absolutely inaccurate, the lowest form of journalism, except to call it journalism dignifies it. Paula Scully said that Collier and Horowitz had called David continually before he finally relented and allowed them to interview him. Said Scully, I met Horowitz the same day David met him, and we gave him dinner at David's apartment in Boston. I left as soon as I saw his tape recorder. I didn't even want a cough of mine on that tape. When David read the article in Playboy, it devastated him beyond belief. David made a mistake by talking. Everyone makes mistakes. But David didn't realize until too late how big of a mistake he had made. Back on drugs, David sought help once again, this time spending a month at St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center in Minneapolis, where he checked in under the name David Kilroy. On April 19, 1984, he was released. The next day, he flew to Palm Beach to spend Easter with his family. I saw him when he left, and he was in very good spirits, said Paula Scully. The treatment had done him a lot of good. It had been the best place in the world for David. He was completely clean of drugs when he went to Florida. He had plans for his life. He was going to write John Siegenthaler to see if he could spend the summer working at the Nashville Tennessean, and he was thinking about going to Boston University to study journalism, which was something that really interested him. But the article in Playboy was the down point in his life. It was like taking 10 steps back. And that article really was like taking 10 steps back because, he already feels terrible about himself. He's already feeling like the family hates him, that he's not good enough, that he's this black sheep and they'll never let him in. And then he went and spoke to Playboy and told them the honest truth of his life, and they really milked it for every bit of drama and bitterness that they could. And now the family definitely doesn't want him anywhere near them because they think, you've always dragged us down with your drug problems and you've embarrassed us. And now you're going out and publicly talking about how you think that life has been terrible. And, we just don't want any part of you. So when he went down to Palm Beach after his drug rehabilitation situation, Paula says that he was off drugs. But as soon as he got to Palm Beach, the Kennedys were like, sorry, there's no room here, no room in the inn. So you go find your own way. And so he had to go stay somewhere else. The book says that in Palm Beach, David checked into a $292 a night 2-room suite at the Brazilian Court Hotel because he was told there was no room for him at the Kennedys' North Ocean Boulevard estate. For a time, his favorite younger brother, Doug, now a 17-year-old senior at Georgetown Prep, stayed in a room across the hall from him. For the next 5 days, David drank and used drugs heavily, hotel employees said later. David, they said, was at the hotel bar by 8 a.m., drinking double vodkas and grapefruit juice, and by 9 a.m. looked like a transient on the street. He was still going strong by midnight. From his brothers and sisters who had visited him at the hotel, Ethel learned that David was on a marathon bender. So the brothers and sisters are going home and being like, Mom, do you know what David's doing? And Ethel can't even be bothered to go and be like, son, what's wrong? You just got back from drug rehabilitation. What is happening? Come stay with us. She's like the coldest person I've ever experienced. Look, here's the thing. I think one of the scariest things about being a parent is knowing that you're not going to do everything right and that your kids are going to be affected by your imperfections. And I think Ethel just did not have what it took to hear any criticism about her parenting because she knew she wasn't a good parent. If she had really tried, if she had been all in, like just doing the best she could with 11 kids, like slap all out every day, waking up, being like, okay, I'm trying to be the best mom, and made mistakes along the way, she could have handled the criticism because she would have thought, I literally was doing the best that I could. Every day doing the best. And I'm sure I did screw up with 11 kids. There's a lot of kids to try to keep track of and raise everybody perfectly the whole time. But she could have taken the criticism because she would have known she had done well. Ethel is so brittle about criticism because she knows that she didn't try. And so to hear, hey, your lack of effort was a huge failure, she's already telling herself she did a terrible job. She knows that. Whether she can verbalize it or not, she can see it when other people are good parents. That's why she complimented Rosalind Carter on her ability to be a mother, because she can see when people are being good parents. And she knows what it looks like. She just didn't know how to do it herself. David makes her angry because David is honest about how bad this was, and his life is a reflection of how bad his life was. Even if he had said nothing out loud, the fact that he does not want to stay in his reality is kind of a reflection on how bad life was. Now, that's not true for everybody who gets on drugs, and I'm not saying that every parent who's ever had a child who's gone to drugs, it's because, well, your home must have been really terrible. That's why they're trying to get out of reality. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if Ethel was honest with herself, she had not created a home that felt safe. And now she's not even willing to go and check on the kids that are struggling, because if she does, then it, again, solidifies the fact that they might be in this situation because she has withheld love from them. On Tuesday, April 24th, she telephoned a Palm Beach attorney and a family friend, Howell Mickey Van Gerbig, frantically asking whether there was anything she could do to help her son. Why are you calling an attorney to see if there's anything you can do for your son? Show up. How about that? How about that kind of help? Be a mom. Why are you calling an attorney a fixer? Is that just the way you handle things as a Kennedy? Get up. Go to the hotel. Say, hey, son, you should not be here. You need to be with us. Bring him back. I just think that I understand that there is a time when you have to cut people off who are just doing damage to themselves and everyone around them. And I totally understand that there are definitely times when you have somebody who is so deep in their addiction that the only way to help them is to say, we will not enable you. But they'd never tried to help him at all with just like love and kindness. They'd passed him off as everybody else's problem for decades. And now he's on a bender in a hotel, and Ethel's first instinct is, let me call an attorney and see what I can do. I don't know, go give your son a hug. Let's start there. She said David was in, quote, bad shape, and then he'd been, quote, very abusive to members of the family, and he was upsetting them. Van Gerbig said Ethel was, quote, very, very confused during the several conversations that they had had that day. I can only imagine as she tries to rework the situation so that she becomes the victim in this whole scenario. He asked her if she knew of any drugs that David might be using, and she told him that he was taking Mellaril, a tranquilizer. Ethel said that she talked to David about Van Gerbig and told him that he would be a good person to help, that she had begged her son to get in touch with the lawyer, and that David had promised that he would call and arrange to have dinner with him that night, but he never did. I called her back that evening and said that what I'd try to do is have breakfast with him in the morning and go over and get him and see what the situation was. Van Gerbig had also advised Ethel to contact Dr. Sheldon Konigsberg of New York, who was, quote, very savvy on drugs. He also told her something that she already knew. Avoid publicity. Who gives a damn about publicity? Your kid is freaking out. He's lost. He's confused. And why are you calling an attorney? See, I feel like we must just not be getting the whole picture here, because I don't understand why a parent would call an attorney. Was he trashing the hotel? Was he doing something illegal? I mean, obviously drugs are not legal, but what was he doing that she thought that her first course of action was to call a lawyer? Why wasn't her first course of action to call a doctor? Why wasn't her first course of action, like I've said, go and see your kid? Because you just wonder how much she could have done for David if she had just put aside her own ego and thought, I'm just going to have to grit my teeth and bear the fact that he's going to blame me but all I can do now is show up for him, and then just done it. But that would have been too much for Ethel to have done. To think of somebody else like that? That night, David talked to a drug counselor and admitted that he'd had 9 or 10 drinks and a lot of cocaine. 9 or 10, I think he had more than that. If he was drinking from 8 a.m. to midnight, I'm sure he had more than 9 or 10 drinks. At 9 a.m. on Wednesday, April 24th, Paula Schooley was running out the door of the apartment she shared with David in Boston when the telephone rang. It was David calling to tell her that he planned to fly home that day with his cousin Sidney Lawford. They talked for a few minutes about a vacation in the Bahamas scheduled to start in early May, and David said that when he got back home, he planned to go to his AA meeting. He sounded perfectly happy, normal, sober, Scully claimed. Just before 11:30, the hotel manager's secretary, Josephine Dampier, got a call from Ethel, who wanted to make sure David made his flight back to Boston. It's always somebody else's issue. Call this person, call that person, make this person my fixer. You make sure David gets on his plane to Boston. You make sure he does that. Well, Ethel, why don't you make sure? Mrs. Kennedy said no one from the family had seen him since the day before, and when she called his room, no one answered. She asked us to check on him, Dampier said later. While Ethel stayed on the line, the secretary dispatched another employee, desk clerk Elizabeth Barnett, to go to room 107 and check on David. Barnett, accompanied by a porter, stood outside ready to knock. I had an ominous feeling, she said. Call it a mother's gut instinct or whatever, but I knew what we would find. We knocked, but there was no answer. I opened the door a little and peeked in, but I didn't see him. The beds were made up, and a green duffel bag was on one and a dollar bill was on the other. She stepped into the room. The shades were drawn. Clothes were scattered around. And then she saw David. He was sprawled on his back, fully dressed, lying on the floor between the 2 beds. She bent down and felt David's neck for a pulse. There was none. Barnett ran back to the front desk and reported to Josephine Dampier what she had found. I told Mrs. Kennedy that we'd call her right back because we had to get the paramedics, Dampier said. 10 minutes later, hotel executive Gerald Beebe called the Kennedy estate. We found your son and the paramedics have arrived, he told her. He's dead, isn't he? Ethel said. I'm sorry, yes, Beebe responded. She made a mother's sound, a strange sound like a gasp, and hung up the phone. It isn't as though this is entirely unpredictable. I don't want to make light of her pain. I'm sure that losing David was painful. He was a child of her own body, but she hadn't acted like she liked him at all. And for her to now be dramatic, like, what? Yeah, I mean, this was the trajectory, was it not? Is this not what you expected? And is this not what you secretly hoped for? Because if you'd wanted a different outcome, you would have done something personally. You'd have personally stepped in. I know that's harsh, and I'm sure there will be people in the comments who are like, that's pretty harsh. You're saying she wanted him to die? I'm not saying that she actively schemed and plotted and was very consciously aware that she hoped that something would happen. But I just think that her lack of personal involvement in his well-being said that she didn't really care what happened. What was going to be was going to be. And sometimes, people make their life choices. There's nothing you can do about it. Like this whole attitude of like, well, it's out of my hands. I wish he'd made different life choices, but he just didn't. And my whole thought is, well, the guy was in his 20s. So yeah, he was making his own life choices, but I just feel like things had led to this point. And her lack of involvement in his childhood and now his lack of involvement now as an adult when he's clearly crying out for help. I'm sure she thought she was doing things like when she went and visited him in his rehab center in California. But the fact that she was so secretive about it and like made sure that it was all under the cover of visiting other friends, it would have just smacked of like, don't come here and do me any favors. If you were David, it'd be like, just don't do me the favor. And the thing is that as much as he says that he wanted her love, he was very angry with her. So I'm sure that any time she may have tried to extend an olive branch, we don't know all the times they were together, he probably smacked the olive branch right out of her hand and it made her not want to come back again. So it's just like a very divisive situation because he's calling and calling and calling for her. She never wants to come. Then she deigns to meet him where he's at, potentially. And then he was probably very vicious to her, wanting her to hear his pain and hear, take some responsibility for it. Well, she doesn't want to do that. So it was just ugly, 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 ugly. The book goes on to say that Carolyn Kennedy and Sidney Lawford, still in their bathing suits, arrived at the hotel and identified the body. They were followed shortly by Jean Kennedy Smith. A priest, Father Dan O'Brien from St. Edward's Catholic Church, where the clan worshipped when in town, anointed the body before it was removed. Afterward, Paula Scully said of her last conversation with David, "I didn't know he was going to die, or otherwise I would have talked to him forever." David's body was taken to the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's office. There, Joe Kennedy, now 31, married, a father and the head of a public interest company to help the poor obtain fuel to heat their homes, paced back and forth while the autopsy was conducted. Cause of death was an overdose of cocaine, the powerful painkiller Demerol, and the tranquilizer Mellaril, the coroner said. In David's room, police found 1.3 grams of high-grade cocaine. Investigators would once again probe the possibilities of a cover-up. Had someone flushed drugs down the toilet before the police arrived? Had a syringe and other evidence been removed from the room? After the autopsy, David's body was placed in a black station wagon and driven to the West Palm Beach funeral home. In 3 weeks, he would have turned 29. It was a very difficult time for all the members of our family, including David's mother and his brothers and sisters, who tried so hard to help him in recent years, Ted said in a statement released by his Washington office. All of us loved him very much. We trust in God. We all pray that David has finally found a peace that he did not have in life. Within hours of David's death, Ethel talked with Reverend Gerald Creedon, who had been affiliated with St. Luke's in McLean. She showed remarkable inner strength and confidence, he said. She seemed more concerned with other members of the family and how they were taking the loss. She is supportive of them. Ethel's faith is remarkable and very real, not a cold faith, he added. Why me has never been in Ethel's vocabulary. Well, I don't think that Ethel would want to be introspective enough to ask the question, why me? I don't think she wants to ask any questions. I think that if she ever started questioning God about why he had allowed things to happen, I think that's the only foundational thing she had in her life. As we've said many times before, I think Ethel's love of the church was because her life growing up had had no foundation. So the church and God those were the things that led to stability. If she had any stability in life, it was the consistency of the church, the consistency of Mass, going and saying the same things, doing the same rituals. So she could not afford to ask any questions that would have disturbed that one place where things were safe and normal and sane. I don't want to call it a blind faith, but I feel like it was not a faith necessarily born out of her own intellectual curiosity. Not like, of course, like many of us who have been raised with people who taught us about the faith. Like, we believe it because we love them and we don't think they would lie to us. But then later, as we grow up, we begin to own that faith out of our own curiosity. Like, yes, I've heard all these things to be true, but I need to believe it. I need to know this is true because I've accepted it. I've looked into it. It's not just like, well, my mom said, and I just don't know if Ethel ever got to the point where the things that she learned growing up were things that belonged to her because she had the intention of finding those things to be true herself, or if it was just always, I'm not questioning anything because as soon as I do, the dominoes go down. Anyway, no one will ever know. And when it comes to questions of faith, we have to just believe it's between Ethel and the Lord, but I'm just saying. On the drive to Hickory Hill for a private funeral service, Ethel asked that the clan stop at Arlington National Cemetery so she could pray at the graves of David's father and uncle. At the house, Ethel spent time alone in a room with her son's coffin. That night, there was yet another wake. Ham, turkey, macaroni casserole, tomato aspic, and lasagna were heaped on buffet tables. Composed, stoic, Ethel told a friend that she believed David had joined his father in heaven. On April 27, 1984, David was buried alongside his grandfather, family patriarch Joseph P. Kennedy, in the family plot at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts. Ethel's brother, Jim, and his wife, Virginia, were still in California when they heard the news. Virginia called Hickory Hill. "Ethel, I just wanted you to know that we're thinking about you. And you're in our prayers," she said. "Gee, kid, thanks so much," Ethel responded. "Thank Jimmy for thinking of me. It's great to hear from you. Sorry you couldn't make the funeral, but I'll call you when I'm on the West Coast." Virginia felt like crying, but she remembered clearly that Ethel was strong as a horse. I said, "You know, Ethel, Jim said a very interesting thing. He said that maybe David's death will cause the other children in the family to wake up if they have a problem. Ours and the Skakel family and the rest of yours." And she said, "I beg your pardon, just what does Jimmy mean by that?" And I said, "Well, think about it. There's a lot of kids in the family, and who knows how they're going to turn out." But Ethel's angry, and that was the end of the call. Well, of course, Ethel was angry. How dare somebody suggest that this sort of tragedy could happen again, or that there's anything wrong with her children? Ethel, wake up. Yes, David has passed away, but David's not the only one on drugs, All right, this next chapter is entitled End of a Dynasty. It's not very long. When David was born in June 1955, the Kennedys' 5th wedding anniversary present, Ethel had a large pool of relatives and friends from which to pick a godmother. Her 3 sisters-in-law, Jean, Pat, and Eunice, her own 3 sisters, Georgianne, Pat, and Anne, plus an endless list of friends. In the end, though, she selected the oldest sibling, Georgianne, a choice that would prove to be both prescient and ironic. For of all Ethel's children, David turned out to be the most like Georgianne, precocious, sensitive, troubled, extremely fragile. Like David, Georgianne, too, had had a love-hate relationship with her mother, Big Anne, who had criticized and rejected her while doing her best to mold her into her own image. Said little Georgianne, "My grandmother always harassed my mother. You've got to go to Elizabeth Arden's. You've got to do something about how you look. You're not pretty." Stick that in a person's head long enough, and they believe it. And sadly, both Georgianne and David shared a fatal flaw in the Skakel family genes. They had severely addictive personalities, more so than any of the other Skakels or Kennedys of their generation. Now, in the early 80s, as the godson was sliding deeper into heroin, the godmother's descent into booze and pills had escalated to a critical point. Georgianne's husband, George Terrian, himself an alcoholic, now spent most of his time living at the New York Athletic Club. Georgianne's children were off, like Ethel's, dealing with their own problems. Georgianne, who had lost part of a lung to cancer in the early 70s, now lost half of her other lung. She was living in that mausoleum of a home, and she was lonely and frightened and hurting and afraid, said her cousin Betty Skakel Medale. In Greenwich, Georgianne had become a prisoner of Sursum Corda, a recluse who didn't drive or fly. She hadn't done much beyond the grounds of her home in years. Her closest companions were Jasmine Andrews, the cook, and Bernie Kavanaugh, the chauffeur, who spent hours polishing Georgianne's rare and rarely used black Austin Princess, the same Van den Plas model the Queen Mother rode in. Georgianne's contact with the outside world was mostly by telephone. She spent long hours talking through the night, often incoherently, to her sister-in-law Virginia Skakel and to Betty Medale. She ran the world from her phone, as little Georgianne put it. Ethel, like all the Skakels, knew Georgianne was in serious trouble. But Ethel, struggling with her own problems, knew better than to stick her nose into Georgianne's business. Her sister had always had little use for her opinions, she knew. But at one point, Ethel did break with tradition, long enough to send Georgianne a lengthy letter, according to Betty Medale. During one of our conversations, she told me that she'd gotten a 10-page letter from Ethel, who told her what she should do was to stop her drinking. Georgianne was furious and terribly hurt, because Ethel had taken it upon herself to lecture her about a subject that Georgianne thought was none of Ethel's business. Georgianne had the feeling of being hit when she was down. She gave me the impression that she responded with 5 words, replete with invective. Ethel never had any connection with Betty, particularly after the Michael Medale murder case in the 50s. She was, however, aware of Georgianne's friendship with Virginia Skakel. Well, yes, she was aware about the friendship with Virginia Skakel. And Ethel, as she was wont to do, felt that she should tell other people what to do with their lives and call in help and have other people fix situations. She did the same thing with Virginia Skakel. Here she is trying to put a guilt trip on Virginia about calling Georgianne some more, when Virginia called Georgianne every day and Ethel never called her. Listen to this ridiculousness. "It's wonderful that you're so close to my sister," Ethel once told Virginia. "You should call Georgianne more often." And later Virginia said, "That's about the only personal thing I can remember that Ethel's ever said to me about poor Georgianne. And it's amazing that she said that. She knew I spoke with Georgianne every day, and I think Ethel thought that she really should have been calling Georgianne more. I think she felt guilty." Virginia said that as Georgianne's alcoholism worsened, no one among her siblings, except for Rushton, made a move to help her. The reasons had to do with ancient childhood rivalries and adult envy. Ethel and her sisters were still jealous that Georgie Ann was the only sister who had benefited over the years from the many perks of Great Lakes Carbon, because of her marriage to the two company officials, John Dowdall and George Terrian. The acrimony also dated back to when they had been children, and Georgie Ann, traditionally left in charge when Big Ann traveled, had often acted bossy and condescending to the younger children, something that they never forgave or forgot. Well, what was poor Georgie Ann supposed to do, always being left in charge of all of these kids? I think there was there 7 of them? I can't remember. I get the two families mixed up. There was a lot of kids, and it was Georgie Ann. It was on her plate to deal with all these kids. It seems that, even as a kid, as a kid, you'd have thought, oh, Georgie Ann's so bossy all the time. But as an adult, it seems like with all of the powers of maturity, you could have seen that she was really up against it, having been put in charge of all of the kids, and she was but a child herself. Seems like you would have been like, yeah, you were kind of bossy, but I get it now. But no, these people are so perpetually childish. It seems that maturing was never in their future. Finally, in May 1982, when Georgie Ann was in Greenwich Hospital, her children made a last-ditch effort to save her. We decided we weren't going to let Mother die like a Bowery bum, little Georgie Ann said. How decent. They discreetly contacted the Freedom Institute in New York, a counseling facility for alcoholics and drug addicts, for help. The resulting intervention involved a heart-rending confrontation between the children, Georgie Ann, and counselors from the Institute. Because the subject of her alcoholism had never been discussed so openly, and certainly never in front of strangers, Georgie Ann, lying in her hospital bed, was humiliated and angry. Institutionalization of any kind terrorized her, and she still felt intense guilt about Alexandra, the retarded daughter she had been forced to lock away years earlier. Through the Freedom Institute, Georgie Ann was placed in St. Mary's Rehabilitation Hospital in Minneapolis, her first and last such treatment. Ironically, St. Mary's was also David Kennedy's last stop before he made his ill-fated trip to Palm Beach. Let me just say that I understand the family was like, Mother is in great need of help. But by the way, Mother's old now. Mother's needed help for years. And everybody pretending that Mother wasn't an alcoholic of the extreme variety and that Mother wasn't popping pills. Now, as she's laying in the hospital bed with a fourth of each lung or whatever, is this really the time to decide that you're not going to let her die like a Bowery bum? Substance abuse is so treacherously difficult on all the family members. So I don't want to come, rearing up on my high horse and be like, well, you guys, listen, is that really the right way to do it? It's like, what is the right way to do it when somebody is struggling and has been deeply struggling for years and years? I understand that they now want to help her, but what did they think? What did they think that her reaction was going to be? Lying in the hospital bed, weak, dying, feeling like a shadow of themselves. And then everyone marches in there and is like, you're an alcoholic. You've been popping pills. You're a mess. I mean, I kind of can't blame the old lady for being like, what the bleep is this? I think even under the best circumstances, having everyone come in and be like, well, we've been watching your demise low these many years and you're just a hot mess and, you failed us all. I think that would be difficult under the best of circumstances. But there you are lying in the hospital bed with hardly any lungs left. It would have been like, well, maybe you guys should have spoken up sooner. Anyway, well, Georgie Ann Terrian was at St. Mary's. George Terrian was forced to go into rehab himself at the Betty Ford Clinic. He'd taken the cure several times before, but always returned to drinking. For years, a functional alcoholic, George had been given a final ultimatum by the board of directors at Great Lakes Carbon, where he was vice president. Either sober up once and for all, or be fired. After a month of treatment at St. Mary's, Georgie Ann came home in early June 1983, dry but still angry, irate at her children for putting her there, for bringing her lifelong problem to the surface. And just like David, Georgie Ann quickly returned to her deadly habit. Despite having agreed to go into rehab, George Terrian was fired by Great Lakes Carbon a few weeks after his release. For the first time in their lives, Georgie Ann and her 7 children found themselves without Great Lakes Carbon perks that they'd been so accustomed to. The use of company cars, planes, parking spaces in Manhattan, telephone credit cards, secretaries, and a New York apartment decorated all in white by Rushton's daughter, Julie Skakel, an interior designer. George's ouster touched off a running feud between the Terrians and those members of the Skakel family who had given him the boot. Meanwhile, Georgie Ann's sisters, who never benefited from those perks in the first place, Ethel included, wore Cheshire grins. To mourn their fate, Georgianne's children placed a small bronze plaque on their favorite stool in Martin's, a popular Greenwich bar and Skakel hangout. The plaque read, CWP, 1983. The initial stood for Children Without Perks. I don't really get these rich people jokes. On August 25th, 1983, 3 months after her treatment in Minneapolis, Georgianne Skakel Dowdle-Tarian died at Sursum Corda at age 65. You know, I've been saying that she was this old lady because I think I just was not doing the math properly in my head. 65. She's been a spring chicken. This is terrible. Her obituary in the Greenwich Times said she had passed away after a lengthy illness. Yeah, the length of her life. She's been an alcoholic since she was 15 years old. My mother actually died of alcoholism, little Georgianne acknowledged later. It took me a long time to be able to say that. If anybody asked, I'd say cancer. You guys, I don't know. Maybe it's just because I'm sick and I have very little patience. But what are you talking about? It took you would have said cancer. This is why things have gotten so bad. I just could barely admit that it was alcoholism. She's been an alcoholic your entire life. Little Georgianne was put in numerous bad situations because of her parents' alcoholism. Remember the chapter where she was in that terrible accident? Everyone in the car, all the adults in the car are like drinking, and then they're in a terrible accident, and she climbs up out of the wreckage, and you know, she's finding people. One guy doesn't even have his face on anymore, and everybody's hurt and wounded. And it's like, how can you tell me that it was so hard for you to admit that your mother was an alcoholic and that she had died of alcoholism? Your whole life was marked by the fact that she was an alcoholic. She wasn't good at keeping it a secret. Your life was destroyed because she and her partners had all been drinkers. I mean, that you would be like, oh, she died of cancer, but you know that's not true. You know that's not what happened. By any stretch of the imagination. I guess she did have the situation with the lungs and the smoking. So I guess that's where she got off on that. But, come on. Ethel came to Georgianne's funeral in Greenwich and hugged little Georgianne warmly, but there was no discussion about her sister's death or its cause. Almost 8 months to the day after Georgianne Skakel-Tarian's death, David Kennedy overdosed in his hotel room. Little Georgianne was in Palm Beach at the time, but couldn't bear to go to the funeral. A couple of days later, she talked to Ethel. Everything's okay now, Ethel told her, because I know David's with Bobby. She said nothing about her sister. So are we supposed to piece together that she didn't think Georgianne was in heaven? See, that's the thing with Ethel. I think that the people that she liked, she believed went to heaven regardless of their behavior on earth. Because it seems like she ties person's actions into whether they got there or not. I do not, but that seems to be the way she looked at things. And if it was somebody she loved, she just blindly believed they got there. And if it's somebody that she didn't love, she just didn't talk about it, but they're probably pretty hot right now. The tenuous bond that appeared to be holding Ethel and her siblings together in the early 80s was financial, the business created by their father more than 6 decades earlier. But Great Lakes Carbon, like some of George Skakel's middle-aged offspring, had fallen on difficult times. The problems involved poor family management and economic downswings to the steel and aluminum industries. For some time now, Ethel and her 2 surviving sisters, the widowed Pat Cuff in Ireland and the twice-divorced Anne McCooey in Greenwich, had been seeking to cash in some or all of the Great Lakes Carbon stock. As Jim Skakel put it, to the girls a pile of cash was more alluring than a pile of dusty coke. Always in need of money, Ethel was clamoring the loudest, but long-standing agreements restricted the stockholders, the Skakels and the Grahams and the other founding family, from selling shares to outsiders, the only interested buyers. Thus, except for declining annual dividends, Ethel's net worth in Great Lakes Carbon was only a fluctuating and meaningless number on paper. However, in 1983, around the time of Georgianne's death, Ethel received a windfall. Through the efforts of her brother Jim, Great Lakes Carbon implemented an employee stock option. As a result, Ethel had a source to unload some of her shares, $5 million worth to be precise. For the first time in a long time, she was on easy street, at least financially. Ethel could blow through $5 million like it was nothing. Easy street for a hot second. At that point, all of the Grahams and all the Skakels, with the exception of Rushton and George Tarian, who had inherited all of Georgianne's stock and was now the single largest Great Lakes stockholder, decided to sell the company outright. There just wasn't a lot of sentimentality left about Great Lakes Carbon, especially among the next generation, such as Ethel's kids, said Patrick Graham, son of the co-founder. But to their consternation, corporate America wasn't beating down the doors. The for sale sign was out for nearly a year before Horsehead Industries, a holding company whose operations included New Jersey Zinc, inventors of the American process for making zinc oxide, expressed interest. In a leveraged buyout in early 1985, Horsehead picked up Great Lakes Carbon for a song. Depending on who was telling the story, the sale price, never published because both seller and buyer were closely held, ranged from a low of $120 million to a high of $150 million in cash, before taxes. Either way, the profit, which had to be split among many family members, was far less than the Skakels had anticipated, and they were left reeling. The word was that the Skakels weren't bright enough and weren't smart enough, and all they knew was how to fight among themselves. So why not go for the jugular vein, said little Georgie Ann later. We got nailed. Well, was anybody wrong? I mean, that's true. They do only know how to fight amongst themselves. These are people who still held a grudge against their older sister who was left as their mother constantly and continually because she was sometimes bossy to them when they were kids. This is not a bright clan. Ethel, however, was happy with the way things had turned out. She was at least $7 million richer and could look forward to a more secure old age. After the sale, George Terrian moved back to Sursum Corda from New York Athletic Club, a far richer man than he was when he first made dinner for Ethel and Bobby in their little house in Charlottesville in the early 50s. Like his wife, Georgie Ann, Terrian became reclusive, drank more than ever, and doled out small amounts of money to the children, now in their 30s and 40s, none of whom had been named in their mother's will. Whoa, Georgie Ann went out harsh. I guess that's a lesson to us all. Don't call out the alcoholic and drug addict on their deathbed, because you're getting cut out of that will. On August 25th, 1991, Ethel's 36-year-old nephew, John Dowdle, the fourth of Georgie Ann's 6 children, was charged with breaking into Sursum Corda, where he had grown up, and beating his 68-year-old stepfather, George Terrian. I just don't even know what to expect with each paragraph. Terrian, who'd been left with his hands tied, freed himself and was treated at Greenwich Hospital. 2 days later, Dowdle was arrested in New York City and turned over to Greenwich police, who charged him with first-degree unlawful restraint, assault, third-degree burglary, and making threats. He was released on $25,000 bail, and the charges were eventually dismissed. Little more than a year later, George Terrian died while waiting liver transplant, so he could, as one embittered Skakel put it, drink for another 40 years. Terrian had bequeathed the bulk of the estate he had inherited from Georgie Ann, some $14 million plus the proceeds from the sale of Sursum Corda, to Harvard and the University of Virginia Law School, the 2 schools that he and Bobby had attended together. The children got not a penny, except for the contents of the house. John Dowdle was left out of the will altogether. Not surprisingly, you come up and beat the old man, I don't think you should expect to get a penny. Terrian was buried next to his wife in St. Mary's Cemetery in Greenwich. Ethel was at the funeral and was shocked that George hadn't left anything substantial to us, said little Georgie Ann. She couldn't believe it. Yeah, it's kind of surprising, but then again, I mean, if the kids were of the sort that would show up to the house to beat you, I can see why he was a little slow to hand out and dole out the pennies. But George Terrian had never really liked them. I think he'd always married into the family for the money, and he'd gotten good use out of that while he could. But it does seem strange that he wouldn't have just given the money to the kids. I mean, what difference is it to him now? He's dead, so he can't use it, so might as well give it to the people who are still alive. But some people are very weird about wills. The way I think about wills is this. Just don't expect anything from anyone, and then you're never disappointed if they don't leave you anything. I've seen so much drama because of wills. And, you know, in my extended family, so much drama has gone down because somebody didn't leave somebody something in their wills. And it is shocking sometimes when people don't, especially if you were very close to them, the decisions that people make. And also the manipulations that can surround an older person when they're writing their will, based on, you know, who might be helping them do that. There's all kinds of drama that goes down. But, like, you didn't love the person in life because of what you thought they would leave you. So if you just never expect anything, you never get disappointed and you never have to feel embittered about it. You know, it's like you love them because you love them, not because you were being nice to them and hoping that they'd leave you something. But if you have a difficult relationship with somebody in life and you don't really get along with them and, you know, In this case, their own mother didn't leave them anything, so why would their stepfather leave them anything, especially after he'd been beaten by one of the 7 of you? It doesn't really surprise me that he decided to give everything to Harvard and to the University of Virginia. Doesn't surprise me at all, but, people are always just in a tizzy, wringing their hands. Can you believe the way the will turned out? Yeah, because people make wonky decisions at the end. Just don't expect anything. That's my advice. Anyway, I will see you guys later this week and, of course, on Friday for the Friday News Roundup. Some of you guys really enjoy that. All right. Bye. Have a great day.